The vampire king stood frozen at his castle gates, staring at the 10-year-old who bore his dead wife's eyes. But the child clutching a faded photograph wasn't seeking reunion, she was running from the hunters who'd raised her to kill him. The ancient iron gates of Ravencrest Castle groaned under the weight of centuries as Aldrich stepped forward, his pale fingers wrapped around cold metal bars that had witnessed more sorrow than any structure should bear. The child before him shifted her weight to the balls of her feet, a defensive stance he recognized from warriors 3 times her age, and the silver at her belt caught moonlight like captured stars. Those violet eyes, so achingly familiar, studied him with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating prey. "You have her eyes," he wanted to whisper, but the words lodged in his throat like broken glass. Instead, he watched as she lifted the photograph between them like a shield, the edges worn soft from countless nights of examination, and he could make out the ghostly outlines of 3 figures captured in happier times, when love had seemed stronger than the darkness gathering at their borders. "I know what you are," she repeated, and her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction that only the very young or the very damaged possessed. The vampire king felt something crack inside his chest, a sound like winter branches snapping under impossible pressure, as he realized that the child he had mourned for 10 years had been shaped into the instrument of his destruction. "Your mother used to stand just like that," he said finally, his voice barely more than wind through empty corridors. "She had the same way of tilting her chin when she thought someone was lying to her." Lyra flinched as if struck, her grip tightening on the photograph until her knuckles went white, and for a moment the mask of cold determination slipped to reveal something raw and uncertain beneath. "The hunters trained you well," Aldrich continued, noting the way her eyes tracked his slightest movement, the unconscious shift of her weight that kept her ready to run or fight. "But they could not train away what you inherited from her. From us." The word hung in the air between them like a challenge, and he watched as confusion flickered across features that were Seraphina's legacy made flesh. Marcus Kane had found her in the ashes of what had once been love, a baby whose cries cut through smoke and flame like accusations against a universe that allowed such cruelty to flourish unchecked. The sacred order operated from a fortress carved into mountain stone, its halls echoing with the prayers of those who believed that humanity's survival depended on the extinction of anything that had once been human, but was human no longer. Cain told her stories of monsters who stole children from their beds, of creatures that wore familiar faces while harboring appetites that could never be satisfied, of a particular beast who had gathered power by convincing both vampire and human that coexistence was possible when everyone knew such dreams led only to graveyards. "Your parents died heroes," he would say, holding her after nightmares left her gasping and reaching for comfort that felt like memory, even when she could not name its source. "They tried to escape the monster who held them prisoner, tried to protect you, and they paid with their lives because evil always demands the highest price from those who dare to love." The other hunters watched her train with a mixture of pride and unease, noting how she moved faster than any child should, how her reflexes bordered on supernatural, how she could track movement in darkness that would blind ordinary humans. Cain explained it as divine blessing, the Creator's way of giving humanity champions who could match their enemies strength for strength. But Lyra sometimes caught whispers that carried different explanations wrapped in words like contamination and half-breed and weapon. On her 10th birthday, Cain presented her with the photograph, its edges already showing wear from whatever journey had brought it to his possession, and she stared at the 3 figures frozen in time with a recognition that felt like drowning. The man in the image had kind eyes and gentle hands resting on a woman's shoulders, and the woman held a baby with the sort of careful tenderness that spoke of fierce love and protective instincts. And Lyra knew with certainty that transcended logic that she was looking at the family she had lost and the monster she had been born to destroy. "Find him," Cain commanded, pressing silver weapons into hands too small to wield them properly, but steady enough to carry out their purpose. "End this. End him. End the threat he represents to every innocent soul who still believes in the possibility of peaceful sleep." The castle's interior greeted Aldrich like an old wound that refused to heal properly, every shadow and curve holding echoes of laughter that had been silenced too soon. His footsteps on ancient stone created a rhythm that matched the hollow beating in his chest as he climbed the spiral staircase toward the wing he had sealed off 10 years ago, when hope had died in his arms and left nothing but the taste of ash and failure. The nursery door stood exactly as he had left it, brass handle tarnished by neglect and time, and his hand trembled as he turned it to reveal a space preserved like a shrine to everything he had lost. Dust motes danced in moonlight streaming through tall windows, settling on toys that would never know the touch of small fingers again, and he moved through the room like a sleepwalker navigating a familiar nightmare. The rocking horse stood in the corner where Seraphina had placed it, its painted mane still glossy despite the years. And when he touched its curved neck, the memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. She had been singing in the ancient tongue, her voice weaving harmonies that seemed to call forth peace from the very air, while baby Lyra giggled and reached for shadows that danced across the ceiling in response to her mother's magic. Those had been the golden days when treaties with human settlements seemed possible, when vampire covens looked to Ravencrest as proof that their kind could evolve beyond the hunger that had defined them for millennia, when love had felt stronger than the fear and hatred that poisoned so many hearts. Marcus Kane had been nothing more than a name whispered in intelligence reports then, a minor figure in a radical faction that most humans dismissed as extremist fanatics. But extremism had a way of growing in the dark, like poisonous mushrooms feeding on decay and resentment. The attack had come without warning, silver blessed fire consuming the lower halls while hunters moved through the castle like a plague of locusts, destroying everything that spoke of peace or cooperation. Seraphina had fought with the desperation of a mother protecting her young, her diplomatic training forgotten as she wielded magic and blade with equal fury. But love was not always enough to overcome superior numbers and careful planning. Aldrich had arrived too late, finding only charred remains and the echo of his daughter's cries fading into smoke and silence, and he had spent 10 years believing that failure was the defining moment of his existence. Now Lyra stood at his gates with weapons trained for his destruction, and he understood that Cain's cruelest victory had not been the death he had dealt, but the weapon he had forged from innocence and loss. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The dawn brought with it a tension that seemed to thicken the very air around Ravencrest Castle as Aldrich extended an invitation that carried the weight of desperation wrapped in careful diplomacy. "You cannot return to them now," he said quietly, watching as Lyra's violet eyes darted between the forest shadows where pursuit might already be gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. "They will have felt your hesitation, sensed the crack in your certainty, and Marcus Kane does not tolerate weakness in his weapons." The words hit their mark as intended, and he saw her spine straighten with the defiance of youth that refused to acknowledge vulnerability, even when it bled through every carefully constructed defense. Elena Thorne materialized from the shadows with the fluid grace that marked her as one of the Vampire King's most trusted lieutenants. Her silver hair catching moonlight as she assessed the child with eyes that had seen centuries of war and understood the tactical implications of harboring what amounted to a living declaration of hostilities. "The protective wards hum to life at my command," she said without preamble, addressing Aldrich while keeping her gaze fixed on Lyra with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential threat levels. Ancient magic woven into the very stones of this place, bloodline locked and keyed to your essence, but maintaining them while sheltering her will drain our reserves and signal our position to every hunter within 100 miles. Lyra listened to this exchange with the focused attention of someone trained to catalog weaknesses and exploit tactical advantages, but something in Elena's matter-of-fact tone suggested a protection offered without condition rather than a trap disguised as sanctuary. "I will not stay in your tower like some princess waiting for rescue," she declared, her voice carrying echoes of Cain's training in its refusal to show gratitude or need. "The servants' quarters will suffice, close enough to observe but separate enough to maintain independence." And Aldrich felt something twist in his chest at the careful distance she maintained even while accepting shelter. Elena nodded approval at this arrangement, recognizing the wisdom of keeping the hunter child where they could monitor her movements while respecting the boundaries that made cooperation possible. And within the hour, Lyra found herself installed in chambers that had once housed trusted staff, but now felt like a comfortable prison with exits she immediately began to catalog. The room itself contradicted every expectation Cain had planted in her mind about vampire lairs, furnished with simple wooden furniture that spoke of function over opulence, and windows that let in natural light without the heavy curtains she had expected to find, blocking out the sun's deadly rays. A portrait hung on the far wall, oils still vibrant despite their age, depicting a woman with violet eyes and gentle smile, holding a baby whose features promised to echo her mother's beauty. And Lyra found herself drawn to study the careful brushstrokes that captured not just physical resemblance, but the unmistakable warmth of a father painting his beloved family. Children's books in languages she recognized, and others that remained mysteries, lined a small shelf, their spines worn from repeated handling and their pages marked with the careful notes of someone determined to give their child every advantage education could provide. And each discovery felt like a small earthquake in the foundation of everything she had been taught about the monster she was meant to destroy. The tactical part of her mind noted exit routes and defensive positions while mapping guard rotations and identifying potential weapons. But another part, one she had spent years learning to silence, whispered questions about the disconnect between Cain's stories and the evidence of her own eyes. The morning brought visitors wrapped in mist and malevolent purpose, as Marcus Cain's tracking spell, woven into the photograph's silver frame during years of patient preparation, guided him through forest paths that seemed to resist his passage, with thorns that caught at his cloak and shadows that shifted when he was not looking directly at them. The strike team he had assembled moved with the disciplined precision of those who had spent lifetimes learning to hunt creatures faster and stronger than human flesh should ever become, their silver weapons blessed by priests who understood that some evils required divine intervention to defeat, and their hearts hardened by stories of loved ones lost to the endless hunger that drove the undead to prey upon the innocent. Cain stood before the castle gates as dawn painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, his weathered face set in lines of implacable determination as he raised his voice to carry across ancient stones that had witnessed more diplomatic failures than successes. "I have come for my daughter," he called, the words echoing off walls that had heard similar demands spoken in languages dead for centuries and by men whose bones had long since turned to dust. "The child you harbor belongs to the sacred order, trained and blessed for purposes you cannot comprehend, and I offer you one opportunity to return her before this conversation becomes a declaration of war that will end with your ashes scattered to the winds." The great hall of Ravencrest Castle seemed to hold its breath as two forces that had shaped the child's existence finally faced each other across polished stone floors that reflected torchlight like pools of captured fire. Aldrich entered with the measured pace of one who had learned that apparent calm could be a weapon more devastating than any blade, his ancient eyes taking in every detail of Cain's positioning, while noting the subtle hand signals the hunter leader used to direct his team into flanking positions. Lyra watched from the gallery above, her heart hammering against her ribs as she observed the two men who represented everything she knew about love and loss, protection and betrayal, and found herself analyzing their words for clues about which version of her history contained more truth than comfortable lies. Cain spoke with the practiced authority of one accustomed to being obeyed without question, his voice carrying undertones of paternal affection mixed with steel that promised swift retribution for defiance. "She is my daughter in every way that matters," he declared, ignoring the way Lyra flinched at possessive certainty in his tone. "I raised her, trained her, gave her purpose when she had nothing but the ashes of her murdered family, and I will not allow a creature like you to corrupt what I have built." Aldrich's response came weighted with centuries of diplomatic experience and the careful restraint of one who understood that words could prevent bloodshed or guarantee it, depending on their precision. "The child bears my bloodline and my wife's eyes," he replied quietly, noting how Cain's expression flickered with something that might have been uncertainty before hardening back into familiar patterns of righteous anger. "She carries gifts that mark her as heir to powers you have spent her lifetime teaching her to despise. And if you truly love her as you claim, you will not force her to choose between the father who gave her life and the man who gave her purpose." The negotiation continued with all the deadly courtesy of a duel fought with words instead of blades, but Lyra felt the foundation of her world shift when Cain spoke of eliminating the Vampire King's weakness if necessary, his casual tone making it clear that her life was valued only as long as she remained useful to his cause. The great hall erupted into chaos as carefully laid plans dissolved under the pressure of old hatred and desperate love, silver blades flashing in torchlight as Cain's hunters moved with practiced coordination to breach the castle's inner defenses, while Elena's guards responded with inhuman speed that turned the polished floor into a battlefield painted in crimson and silver. Lyra found herself frozen in the gallery as violence exploded below her, watching men and women she had trained beside fall under vampire claws that moved too fast for human eyes to track, while creatures she had been taught to fear died with expressions of pain that looked disturbingly similar to the grief she recognized in her own heart. A hunter's blade, blessed with holy water and edged with silver sharp enough to carve through vampire flesh like parchment, broke free from the main battle and arced toward where she stood transfixed by the revelation that war looked exactly the same from both sides. But before the weapon could find its mark, Aldrich moved with speed that seemed to fold space around him. The blade meant for her throat found his shoulder instead, silver burning through ancient flesh like liquid fire, while his blood, impossibly red and warm and familiar, spilled across stone floors that had absorbed too much violence over the centuries. The moment their blood touched, Lyra felt something snap into place inside her mind, like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. And suddenly she could sense things that training had never prepared her for. The way Aldrich's pain echoed in her own nerves, the recognition that flowed between them, like a river finding its natural course. The undeniable truth that the monster Cain had taught her to hate shared the same supernatural essence that flowed through her own veins. The vampiric connection blazed to life with the force of a dam bursting. 10 years of suppressed inheritance flooding her consciousness all at once, and she understood with crystalline clarity that everything she thought she knew about her nature and her purpose had been built on foundations of carefully crafted lies. Elena's voice cut through the chaos with commands that sent the remaining hunters retreating toward exits they had scouted but not properly secured, while Cain's furious gaze promised that this defeat was merely the opening movement in a symphony of destruction that would not end until either he or Aldrich lay dead. "You will regret this choice," he called to Lyra as his forces withdrew, his voice carrying the weight of disappointed love transformed into something harder and more dangerous than simple hatred. "When I return with an army to cleanse this place, remember that you chose the monster over the man who saved you." And Lyra felt the last threads of her old life snap as she watched the only father she had ever known disappear into mist and shadow, while promising to return with enough force to turn her newfound sanctuary into a tomb. The infirmary chambers of Ravencrest Castle had witnessed countless recoveries over the centuries, but never had they hosted a scene quite like this one, where Vampire King and Dampier Daughter sat in careful proximity while ancient wounds, both physical and emotional, slowly began to mend. Aldrich's shoulder bore the silver burn that would take days to heal properly, despite his supernatural constitution, the blessed metal having carved through flesh that had survived countless battles and diplomatic assassinations. And Lyra found herself studying the careful way Elena cleaned and bound the injury, with supplies that spoke of long experience in treating weapons designed specifically to cause maximum damage to vampire physiology. The silence stretched between father and daughter like a chasm that years of separation and careful manipulation had carved too deep for simple words to bridge. But finally, Lyra's voice cut through the quiet, with a demand that carried all the authority of someone who had been denied truth for far too long. "Tell me about my mother," she said, her violet eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that reminded him painfully of Seraphina's own way of demanding honesty, even when the truth promised to be more devastating than comfortable lies. Not the victim Cain painted in his stories, not the prisoner he claimed she was, but the woman who loved you enough to die protecting our family. Aldrich's hands stilled on the bandages Elena was applying, and for a moment he seemed to age beyond his already ancient years, as memories rose like tidewater threatening to drown him in their bitter sweetness. "Your mother was extraordinary in ways that transcended her supernatural gifts," he began slowly, his voice carrying the careful cadence of one who had spent decades learning to speak of loss without drowning in it. "She came to me not as victim, but as negotiator, representing a faction within the Hunter Orders who believed that endless war served no one except those who profited from the sale of silver and the manufacture of blessed weapons. Seraphina Blackthorn had been born into a family of legendary vampire hunters, her bloodline traced back through generations of those who had dedicated their lives to protecting humanity from creatures that fed on human essence. But she possessed something that set her apart from her predecessors: the ability to see beyond the comfortable categories of monster and hero that made war seem inevitable rather than chosen. The first time she walked into this very castle, she carried herself with the confidence of one who knew exactly how dangerous her surroundings were, but refused to let fear dictate her actions. And Aldrich found himself remembering the way sunlight had caught in her auburn hair as she examined ancient tapestries that depicted vampire and human working together during the earliest days of both civilizations. She had come to discuss prisoner exchanges and territorial boundaries, but their conversations quickly evolved into something deeper as they discovered a shared vision of a world where strength was measured by the ability to protect rather than destroy, where supernatural gifts were tools for building rather than weapons for tearing down everything that previous generations had worked to create. Their love had grown slowly, carefully, like a garden tended by those who understood that the most beautiful flowers required patience and dedication to bloom properly. And when she chose to abandon her family's calling, to stand beside him as partner rather than enemy, the decision had sent shockwaves through both vampire and hunter communities that reverberated still. Cain's extremist faction had branded her a traitor before the wedding vows were spoken, marking both her and Aldrich for death, with a patience that spoke of long experience in planning the kind of operations that left no witnesses and no evidence except carefully crafted stories about heroes falling to monsters' claws. Elena's voice cut through the heavy atmosphere of memory and regret, with information delivered in the precise tones of one who had spent centuries learning to separate emotion from tactical necessity. "Your mother's greatest gift was not her diplomatic skills or her warrior's training," she said while checking the silver burn's progress with professional detachment that barely concealed deeper concern. "What made Seraphina truly unique was her immunity to the blood curse that has bound vampire kind to territorial violence since the earliest nights of our existence. The words hung in the air like a revelation that recontextualized everything Lyra thought she understood about her heritage and her purpose, and Elena continued with the methodical thoroughness of a scholar presenting research that could reshape the political landscape of two civilizations. Vampires are not naturally violent creatures, despite what human folklore suggests, she explained, while settling into a chair that placed her within easy reach of weapons that gleamed with the subtle luminescence of enchanted metal. The hunger for blood creates a territorial imperative that drives us to defend our feeding grounds against any perceived threat, a magical compulsion woven into our very essence that makes peaceful coexistence nearly impossible without constant vigilance and supernatural willpower. Most vampires spend their entire existence fighting against instincts that demand they view humans as either prey or competitors. But your mother possessed a rare genetic immunity that allowed her to move freely between vampire territories without triggering those defensive responses. This immunity made her invaluable as a negotiator because she could facilitate discussions between vampire lords who would normally tear each other apart rather than share the same room. And when she married your father, that immunity passed to you in a form even more potent than what she possessed. Lyra felt something cold settle in her stomach as she began to understand the true implications of Elena's explanation, realizing that her unique nature made her either the bridge between two species that had spent millennia locked in mutual destruction, or the ultimate weapon that could be used to manipulate both sides into whatever configuration served her controller's purposes. You are not simply half vampire and half human, Elena continued with the relentless precision of someone delivering a diagnosis that would change everything about how the patient understood their own existence. You are something new, something that could allow vampire and human civilization to finally evolve beyond the cycle of violence that has defined their relationship since the first vampire rose from death to hunt among the living. Marcus Kane understood this when he found you in the ruins of your home, and every choice he has made since that night has been designed to ensure that your gifts serve his vision of human supremacy rather than your mother's dream of peaceful coexistence. The ritual chamber deep beneath Ravencrest Castle had been carved from living rock by the first vampire lords who had claimed this territory, its walls inscribed with symbols that predated written language and spoke directly to the supernatural essence that flowed through undead veins like liquid starlight. Lyra stood in the center of a complex pattern etched into the stone floor with materials that gleamed silver and gold in the flickering light of torches that burned with flames touched by magic, her heart hammering against her ribs as Elena explained the process that would unlock memories that had been buried beneath years of careful psychological conditioning. The ritual was dangerous, carrying risks that included permanent madness or complete loss of her human side, but it represented the only way to recover the truth about her early childhood and the events that had led to her family's destruction. Ancient vampire magic flowed around her like water as the ceremony began, Elena's voice weaving incantations in the old tongue, while Aldrich provided the blood connection that would guide her consciousness back through layers of suppressed experience toward the memories that Cain had worked so hard to hide. The world dissolved around her as time became fluid and malleable, carrying her backward through years of training and indoctrination toward a period when her existence had been defined by love rather than purpose. And suddenly she was 3 years old again, sitting in a garden where roses bloomed in impossible colors, while her mother taught her to speak with the small creatures that made their homes among the flowers. Seraphina's voice came to her across the years with crystalline clarity, patient and warm, as she explained how the language of animals differed from human speech in its reliance on emotion and intention, rather than mere words. And Lyra remembered the way rabbits would approach without fear when she spoke to them in the gentle tones her mother had taught her to use. The garden had been a place of peace, where vampire lords and human diplomats had walked together under stars that seemed brighter than any she had seen since. Their conversations carried out in multiple languages as they worked to establish the treaties that would allow their people to share the world without drowning it in blood. Her father's voice joined the chorus of memory as he sang lullabies in the ancient vampire tongue, his deep bass harmonizing with her mother's soprano in melodies that seemed to call forth moonlight and starshine to dance across her nursery ceiling. And she remembered feeling absolutely safe in the circle of their love, even when the wind carried whispers of those who wished their family harm. But the ritual also revealed darker truths, buried beneath the golden memories of early childhood, showing her the night when everything had changed with the sudden violence of a thunderstorm that strikes without warning. She saw Cain moving through castle corridors, with the purposeful stride of one executing a carefully rehearsed plan, silver weapons gleaming in his hands as he cut down guards who had been chosen for their loyalty rather than their suspicious nature, and she watched through the eyes of a terrified child as he cornered her mother in the nursery where love had been the only law. Serafina fought with the desperate fury of a mother protecting her young, her diplomatic training forgotten as she wielded magic and blade with equal skill. But Cain had come prepared for her resistance, and the battle was over before it had truly begun. The ritual showed her Cain's face in those final moments, not wearing the expression of righteous anger she had expected, but something far more complex and devastating. The grief of a man who genuinely believed he was saving the world by destroying the only chance it had for genuine peace, and Lyra understood with horrible clarity that the man who had raised her as a weapon had been twisted by his own noble intentions into something that could commit atrocities while believing himself a hero. The War Council convened in Ravencrest Castle's ancient Great Hall, as storm clouds gathered both literally and metaphorically over the stronghold that had weathered centuries of conflict but never faced a threat quite as multifaceted as the one Marcus Cain had assembled in the forests beyond their walls. Aldrich stood at the head of a table carved from a single massive oak that predated the castle itself, his pale hands spread across maps that showed troop movements and supply lines, with the kind of precision that spoke of intelligence networks built over decades of careful cultivation, while around him gathered the vampire lords who had honored his father's memory by maintaining the fragile peace treaties that Serafina had died trying to establish. Lady Morgana Blackwood, whose territory encompassed the northern mountain passes where human settlements clustered around silver mines that provided both wealth and the means of their own destruction, spoke with the clipped precision of one who had learned to compress centuries of experience into words that cut straight to tactical necessities. Cain's forces number nearly 3,000, she reported while pointing to positions marked on the maps, with small silver pins that caught torchlight like captured stars. Hunter battalions from 6 different orders, each bringing their own specialized weapons and blessed artillery. But more concerning are the vampire covens he has convinced to join his cause. Lord Victor Ashworth, whose ancient features bore the scars of battles fought when the world was younger, and the lines between civilization and wilderness were drawn in blood rather than ink, nodded grimly as he added his own intelligence to the growing picture of their desperate situation. The Shadowmere Coven believes you have been compromised by your attachment to the Dampier child, he said with the careful neutrality of one delivering news that could reshape the political landscape of their entire species. They view her presence here as evidence that you have lost the objectivity necessary to lead our kind, and Cain has promised them territorial concessions in exchange for their military support. Elena Thorne's voice cut through the mounting tension with information that recontextualized everything they thought they understood about their enemy's motivations and capabilities. This is not simply about destroying Aldrich or claiming Lyra as a weapon, she said while spreading out intelligence reports that painted a picture of systematic preparation stretching back years before the child's appearance at their gates. Cain has been building towards something far more ambitious than revenge, or even the elimination of vampire leadership, And the evidence suggests he sees this conflict as the opening movement in a campaign that will reshape the balance of power between human and supernatural civilizations permanently. Lyra stood silent in the shadows near the great fireplace, listening to strategic discussions that treated her existence as both tactical asset and strategic liability. Feeling the weight of responsibility for a war that existed because of what she represented, rather than anything she had chosen to do, and gradually understanding that the peace her mother had died trying to create hung by threads so fragile that a single wrong decision could unravel decades of careful diplomacy. The vampire lord spoke of defensive positions and supply lines, with the matter-of-fact precision of those who had survived countless conflicts, by understanding that sentiment was a luxury that could be indulged only after victory had been secured. But beneath their tactical discussions ran currents of deeper concern about what Kane's success would mean for their kind's long-term survival in a world increasingly hostile to anything that challenged human supremacy. The great hall fell silent when Lyra stepped from the shadows and spoke with a voice that carried echoes of both her mother's diplomatic training and her own 10 years of learning to navigate the deadly currents of hunter politics. "I propose returning to Kane as a double agent," she said, while ignoring the way every vampire in the room tensed at words that could be interpreted as either brilliant strategy or elaborate betrayal. "My unique position gives us advantages that no conventional intelligence gathering could provide, and Kane's emotional investment in maintaining his role as my surrogate father creates vulnerabilities we can exploit if we move carefully enough to avoid triggering his suspicions." Aldrich's response came with the force of a physical blow, his carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal the desperate fear of a father who had already lost everything once and could not bear the thought of repeating that particular agony. "Absolutely not," he said while rising from his chair with movements that spoke of barely controlled panic rather than measured authority. "You have been in my life for less than a week, and I will not risk losing you again to a plan that requires you to place yourself directly in the hands of the man who murdered your mother and spent 10 years turning you into a weapon aimed at my heart." The argument that followed revealed layers of complexity in their relationship that neither had been willing to acknowledge during the careful dance of reconnection they had been performing since her arrival at the castle gates. As Lyra fought to convince him that her insider knowledge of hunter tactics and Kane's psychological patterns represented their only hope of surviving the coming siege, while Aldrich struggled with the impossible choice between tactical necessity and paternal instinct. Elena's intervention came with the cold logic of someone who had learned to separate emotional considerations from strategic imperatives during centuries of warfare that had tested every principle she had ever held sacred. "The child is right," she said, while studying maps that showed the hopelessness of their defensive position against superior numbers and enhanced weaponry. "Kane's forces are too numerous and too well equipped for us to defeat through conventional resistance, and our intelligence networks have been compromised by whatever methods he used to turn vampire covens against their own kind. But Lyra's ability to move freely within his command structure could provide the information we need to identify weaknesses in his plans or create opportunities for targeted strikes that might shift the balance enough to give diplomacy a chance to function." The debate continued through the night, as father and daughter confronted fears that went beyond simple tactical considerations to touch the very heart of what it meant to love someone enough to let them risk everything for principles that transcended individual survival. And finally, Aldrich found himself agreeing to a plan that felt like cutting out his own heart while it was still beating. The hunter encampment sprawled across the forest clearing like a miniature city built for the sole purpose of waging war against creatures that most humans preferred to believe existed only in folklore and nightmares. Its orderly rows of tents and supply wagons speaking to the kind of logistical sophistication that could only be achieved through years of careful planning and substantial financial backing. Lyra approached the perimeter guards, With the confident stride of someone returning from a successful reconnaissance mission, her story of escape and evasion polished during hours of rehearsal with Elena until it contained enough truth to survive casual scrutiny while concealing the emotional revolution that had transformed her understanding of everything she had been taught about good and evil, monster and hero, family and duty. Kane's command tent occupied the center of the encampment like the heart of some vast organism dedicated to destruction. Its interior filled with maps and weapon schematics and caged vampires whose hollow eyes spoke of experiments that violated every principle of civilized warfare. And when he embraced her with the relief of a father welcoming home a lost child, Lyra felt her resolve waver for a moment before the memory of her mother's true fate hardened her heart against manipulation that she now recognized as expertly crafted psychological control. The scope of his ambition became clear as she moved through the camp with the access her position as his adopted daughter provided, observing preparations that went far beyond simple military conquest to encompass what could only be described as systematic genocide disguised as holy crusade. Laboratory tents housed research stations where captured vampires were subjected to procedures designed to extract and weaponize the essence that gave them their supernatural abilities, while weaponsmiths worked around the clock to produce ammunition blessed with compounds derived from her own blood samples that Kane had collected during routine medical examinations throughout her childhood. The revelation that she had been unwittingly providing the raw materials for weapons designed to make vampire hunting as efficient as conventional warfare left her feeling physically sick, but she forced herself to continue gathering intelligence about troop strengths and supply schedules while maintaining the facade of loyalty that her survival depended upon. Kane's ultimate plan crystallized during a strategy session where he outlined his vision of a world where human superiority was maintained through technological advantages that eliminated the supernatural threats that had plagued civilization since its earliest days, and Lyra understood with growing horror that her father and everyone she had come to care about represented nothing more than test subjects in experiments designed to perfect methods of mass extermination. Her attempt at sabotage was subtle, carefully designed to appear like equipment failure rather than deliberate interference. But Kane's paranoia had been honed by decades of hunting creatures whose survival depended on deception and misdirection. And when he discovered evidence of tampering in the laboratory records, his suspicions focused immediately on the one person who possessed both access and motive for betrayal. The chase that followed tested every skill she had learned during 10 years of hunter training as she fought her way through guards who had taught her everything she knew about combat and evasion. Her escape route taking her through forest paths that seemed to shift and change under the influence of vampiric magic that recognized her mixed heritage and offered assistance to one who carried the bloodline of ancient allies. She reached the castle gates just ahead of pursuit that promised swift and terrible retribution for those who chose to harbor traitors. But the intelligence she brought with her painted a picture of Kane's forces that was even more devastating than their worst fears had imagined, because his attack was scheduled to coincide with the new moon, when vampire powers would be at their weakest, and their ability to coordinate defensive magic would be severely compromised. The moment Lyra collapsed within the protective wards of Ravencrest Castle, her body convulsing as the supernatural essence that had been suppressed for 10 years finally broke free from the psychological chains that Marcus Kane had forged around her true nature. Elena recognized the signs of a Dhampir awakening that had been delayed far beyond its natural timing and compressed into a transformation that should have taken months to complete safely. The ancient stones of the castle seemed to resonate with power that poured from Lyra in waves that made the very air shimmer like heat rising from sun-baked stone, while her enhanced senses exploded into awareness that allowed her to hear conversations taking place 3 floors above and smell the fierce sweat of guards positioned on distant battlements. Elena's voice cut through the chaos of sensory overload, with instructions delivered in the precise tones of someone who had guided other supernatural beings through similar metamorphoses. explaining that the awakening process could not be stopped or slowed, but only channeled into patterns that would preserve her sanity while unlocking abilities that made her heritage both blessing and curse. Under Elena's reluctant tutelage, Lyra learned to harness speed that allowed her to cross the Great Hall in the time it took a human heart to beat twice, to focus enhanced hearing until she could track individual conversations within Kane's camp miles away, and most remarkably, to command both vampire magic that drew power from moonlight and shadow and human magic that channeled energy from earth and growing things in combinations that should have been impossible, according to every supernatural law Elena had learned during centuries of study. The abilities came with prices that Kane's training had never prepared her to pay, as superhuman senses brought not just tactical advantages, but overwhelming awareness of every heartbeat within the castle walls, every drop of blood flowing through mortal veins, every pulse of life that called to newly awakened predatory instincts, that whispered suggestions about how easily she could satisfy the hunger that gnawed at her like a living thing with teeth and claws. The blood hunger hit her in waves that left her doubled over and gasping, her enhanced metabolism demanding sustenance that her human upbringing taught her to view as monstrous, while vampire instincts that had been bred into her genetic code over generations urged her to take what she needed from the nearest available source, regardless of moral considerations that seemed increasingly abstract when measured against physical need that bordered on agony. Aldrich found her in the castle's highest tower during one of these episodes, her hands clawed around stone windowsills as she fought against urges that felt like drowning in an ocean of liquid fire, and his voice carried the patient understanding of someone who had spent centuries learning to balance supernatural needs with ethical principles that separated civilization from chaos. "Your mother faced these same struggles," he said while settling beside her with movements careful enough not to trigger reflexes that could prove dangerous to anyone within reach of enhanced speed and strength. She developed techniques for managing the hunger without losing herself to it, ways of feeding that honored both sides of her nature, without compromising the principles that made her fight for peace worth the sacrifices it demanded, and over the following hours, he shared meditation practices that channeled predatory energy into protective instincts and dietary supplements that could satisfy biological requirements without requiring her to view other thinking beings as potential meals. The dawn brought with it a new horror, as Kane's forces delivered their ultimatum through methods designed to test the moral foundations upon which vampire civilization claimed to rest. Their message carried by terrified human civilians, whose only crime had been living in settlements that maintained trade relationships with vampire territories under the peace treaties that Serafina had helped negotiate. The great hall of Ravencrest Castle filled with the sound of weeping as families knelt before the ancient throne that Aldrich had inherited from ancestors who had ruled through strength rather than diplomacy, their children clinging to parents who struggled to maintain composure while facing the very real possibility that their cooperation with vampire lords would cost them everything they held dear. Kane's terms were delivered by a hunter whose voice carried the mechanical precision of someone reading words that had been crafted for maximum psychological impact rather than genuine negotiation, each syllable designed to force Aldrich into choices that would compromise either his principles or his strategic position without offering any third option that might preserve both. Surrender the Dampier child within 24 hours, or watch innocent blood spill every hour thereafter, until either compliance is achieved or no witnesses remain to carry tales of vampire brutality to human settlements that still maintain neutrality in this conflict, the messenger declared, while avoiding eye contact with faces that would haunt his dreams if he allowed himself to acknowledge their humanity, rather than viewing them simply as tactical assets in a war that transcended individual considerations. The vampire lords who had gathered to defend Ravencrest found themselves divided by responses that revealed fundamental differences in how they interpreted their responsibilities to those weaker than themselves, with Lord Victor Ashworth arguing that sacrifice of human allies was an acceptable price for preventing Kane from acquiring the ultimate weapon he sought, while Lady Morgana Blackwood insisted that abandoning those who had trusted them would transform them into the monsters that human folklore claimed they had always been. Aldrich listened to these debates with the expression of someone bearing weight that threatened to crush him beneath obligations that pulled in directions that could not be reconciled through conventional wisdom or political compromise. His ancient eyes reflecting the accumulated grief of centuries spent making decisions that saved some lives by sacrificing others, and the growing realization that leadership sometimes required choosing between different forms of damnation rather than between good and evil. Lyra watched from the shadows as her father struggled with moral equations that had no clean solutions, seeing for the first time the true cost of power that extended beyond personal desires to encompass responsibility for entire civilizations whose survival might depend on choices that no ethical framework could fully justify. And understanding that the war Cain had initiated was designed not just to eliminate supernatural threats, but to force those threats to compromise their own principles in ways that would validate human fears about vampire nature. The breaking point came with the sound of children screaming that carried across the miles between Cain's encampment and the castle walls with supernatural clarity that turned Lyra's enhanced hearing into an instrument of torture, each cry cutting through her consciousness like silver blades designed to maximize psychological rather than physical damage. The family Cain chose for his demonstration had been selected with the cruel precision of someone who understood exactly which emotional buttons would produce the desired response in his target. Parents and children whose only connection to the vampire world had been their willingness to trade fairly with supernatural beings who offered protection in exchange for resources that allowed both communities to prosper rather than merely survive. Elena's intelligence network provided details about the executions that painted pictures no one should have been forced to carry in their memory, descriptions of how Cain's methods combined theatrical brutality with propaganda value that would spread through human settlements like poison, designed to turn moderate voices toward extremism and cooperation toward suspicion. Lyra found herself moving toward the castle gates with the mechanical precision of someone whose emotional reserves had been exhausted beyond the point where rational thought could override moral imperative. Her mind focused on the simple equation that trading her freedom for innocent lives represented the only choice her mother would have recognized as worthy of the principles she had died defending. Aldrich's intervention came with the desperate strength of a father who had already lost everything once and discovered that surviving such loss required reserves of endurance that could not be replenished through any conventional means. His hands gentle but implacable as he blocked her path toward what he understood would be not just surrender, but the destruction of everything Seraphina had worked to build. "I will not lose you too," he said, with a voice that carried the accumulated weight of 10 years spent mourning a daughter he had believed dead, and the impossible choice between saving the child he had found and protecting the innocent lives that Cain was systematically destroying to force exactly this response. Their confrontation escalated into the kind of argument that burns away pretense and careful diplomacy to reveal the raw emotional truths that lie beneath political considerations and tactical necessities. Lyra insisting that her mother's legacy demanded she choose principle over survival, while Aldrich revealed the depth of his own damage from losing Seraphina and his terror that history would repeat itself if he allowed love to override strategic thinking. The intensity of their conflict was interrupted by Elena's arrival with intelligence that recontextualized everything they thought they understood about Cain's ultimate objectives, her face bearing the expression of someone who had discovered something so devastating that it transcended immediate concerns about hostages or territorial disputes. "Cain's experiments with your blood have yielded results that go far beyond improved weapons," she said, while spreading out documents that mapped magical formulas and summoning circles with the precision of someone whose research had uncovered secrets that should have remained buried in the darkest chapters of supernatural history. He has been working toward opening a portal that will allow Malphus the Enslaver to return from the exile that vampire and human mages combined their power to impose 3,000 years ago. And your unique blood represents the final component needed to breach barriers that were designed to hold until the end of time itself. The revelation that Marcus Cain's ultimate goal involved summoning an ancient evil that would enslave both human and vampire civilizations sent shockwaves through the supernatural political landscape that had remained relatively stable since the peace treaties were first established, forcing former enemies to confront the uncomfortable truth that their mutual survival depended on cooperation that transcended centuries of accumulated grievances and territorial disputes. Messages flew between vampire covens and human settlements on wings, both literal and magical, as Elena's intelligence network carried warnings about Cain's true intentions to every faction that possessed enough influence to affect the outcome of what was rapidly evolving from a local conflict into a battle for the future of both species. Lord Victor Ashworth arrived at Ravencrest Castle with forces from 3 northern covens who had initially supported Cain's campaign against what they perceived as Aldrich's dangerous sentimentality, their leader's scarred features bearing the expression of someone who had discovered that principles sometimes required abandoning pride in favor of pragmatic necessity. We were fools to believe that any human faction would honor agreements made with our kind once they possessed sufficient power to impose their will through force alone, he admitted, while studying maps that showed Cain's true military strength, now that defecting hunters had revealed the scope of resources he had assembled through years of careful political manipulation and financial backing from sources that remained ominously unidentified. Lady Morgana Blackwood brought news of human settlements throughout the mountain passes, who had experienced the benefits of vampire protection during harsh winters and bandit raids. Their mayors and council leaders expressing willingness to provide supplies and intelligence despite the risks such cooperation would bring if Cain's forces achieved victory, and began systematic reprisals against anyone who had aided their enemies. Even more surprising were the hunters, who began arriving at the castle gates under cover of darkness, veteran warriors whose conscience had finally rebelled against orders that violated every principle they had sworn to uphold when they first took vows to protect innocent life, rather than serve political ambitions disguised as holy crusades. Captain Sarah Maddox, whose reputation for integrity had made her a respected voice within the Sacred Order for 2 decades, brought with her detailed intelligence about Cain's experimental programs and the locations of facilities where captured vampires were being subjected to procedures that violated every convention of civilized warfare. The man I once followed has been consumed by obsessions that transform noble goals into monstrous methods, she said while presenting documents that mapped the true extent of Cain's operations and revealed financial connections to arms manufacturers and political extremists who viewed supernatural beings as obstacles to human expansion rather than potential allies in building a more secure world. Lyra found herself at the center of these unlikely alliances, her unique nature allowing her to serve as translator between species whose fundamental differences in psychology and physiology had traditionally made communication difficult, even when both sides possessed genuine desire for understanding rather than conquest. Using diplomatic protocols that Serafina had developed during her own bridge-building efforts, Lyra facilitated negotiations that established command structures and supply lines while addressing the practical concerns that arose when creatures with vastly different needs and capabilities attempted to coordinate military operations under the pressure of approaching deadlines that allowed no time for the careful relationship building that sustainable alliances usually required. The castle itself transformed from fortress under siege to headquarters of resistance movement, as vampire lords worked alongside human tacticians to develop strategies that leveraged their combined strengths while compensating for individual weaknesses, their planning sessions revealing levels of tactical sophistication that neither side could have achieved independently. The final assault began as sunset painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold that seemed to echo the blood that would soon stain the ancient stones of Ravencrest Castle. Kane's forces advancing on multiple fronts with the coordinated precision of an army that had spent months drilling for this specific engagement, while their commanders remained hidden in command positions that allowed them to direct the battle without exposing themselves to the supernatural abilities that made vampire warriors so dangerous in direct combat. Lyra led a strike team composed of both hunters and vampires toward the temporary prison camp, where Kane's hostages were being held under guard by soldiers whose instructions emphasized preventing escape rather than protecting their charges, her enhanced senses allowing her to navigate through defensive positions that had been designed to stop conventional forces, rather than someone who possessed both supernatural abilities and intimate knowledge of hunter tactical doctrine. The rescue operation unfolded with the fluid efficiency of teammates who had learned to trust each other's capabilities, despite philosophical differences that might have seemed insurmountable under less desperate circumstances. Vampire speed and strength, combining with hunter weapons training, to overwhelm guards who had expected to face either human rescuers or supernatural attackers, but not coordinated forces that represented the best capabilities of both species, working toward shared objectives. Meanwhile, Aldrich coordinated the defense of the castle's main walls with the strategic brilliance that had made him legendary among his own kind and feared among their enemies, his centuries of military experience allowing him to anticipate Kane's tactics while adapting traditional vampire defensive strategies to account for the presence of human allies whose strengths and limitations required different approaches to positioning and resource allocation. The battle showcased not just the tactical abilities that father and daughter had inherited through bloodline and training respectively, but their growing capacity for cooperation despite 10 years of separation and the psychological damage that Kane's manipulation had inflicted on their relationship, their coordination improving throughout the engagement as they learned to read each other's combat rhythms and anticipate movements that combined their individual strengths into something greater than either could achieve alone. Elena's voice cut through the chaos of battle with intelligence that revealed the true scope of Kane's deception. Her magical communications carrying warnings that the frontal assault represented nothing more than elaborate distraction, designed to draw defenders away from the castle's most vulnerable point, while Kane himself infiltrated the ancient ritual chambers with a small team of specialists whose only mission was to provide the blood sacrifice necessary to complete summoning rituals that had been interrupted 3 millennia ago when vampire and human mages combined their power to banish Malphas the Enslaver to dimensional prison from which escape should have been impossible. The realization that they had been fighting the wrong battle sent shockwaves through both sides as resources were hastily redirected toward defending chambers that most of the castle's current inhabitants had never seen, their existence known only through archive records that documented the earliest days of vampire civilization, when cooperation between species had been necessity rather than idealistic dream pursued by visionaries like Seraphina. The deepest chambers of Ravencrest Castle had been carved from living rock during an age when the boundary between physical and magical reality was far more permeable than modern understanding suggested possible, their walls inscribed with protective symbols that drew power from ley lines running beneath the mountain's foundation, while channeling energies that could either contain ancient evils or provide the focus necessary for their return, depending on the intentions and capabilities of those who activated their dormant potential. Lyra descended stone steps that seemed to pulse with malevolent anticipation as Kane's ritual reached its climactic phase, the air itself growing thick with supernatural energies that made breathing difficult and movement sluggish, while shadows writhed with unnatural life that suggested the barriers between dimensions were already beginning to weaken under sustained magical assault. Kane stood within a circle of carved symbols that glowed with sickly light, drawn from sources that predated civilization itself, his hands moving through gestures that channeled power through Lyra's blood samples into patterns designed to tear holes in reality's fabric large enough for entities that should never have existed to pour through from realms where suffering was the only currency and mercy was considered weakness worthy of immediate correction. The confrontation between Cain and Lyra became something far more complex than simple combat between former allies turned enemies, as he revealed with devastating honesty that his love for her as a daughter had been genuine, even as he prepared to use her essence as the key to unlocking horrors that would transform both their worlds into hunting grounds for creatures whose appetite for pain transcended any hunger that vampire nature had ever produced. Everything I have done has been motivated by love for you and for humanity itself, he said, while deflecting her attacks with skills that reminded her painfully of training sessions when he had been teacher rather than target, and she had believed that the techniques he shared would serve noble purposes rather than facilitate atrocities disguised as salvation. You cannot understand the burden of seeing futures where supernatural beings eventually dominate and enslave human civilization, where peace treaties become chains that bind our species to acceptance of inferior status in hierarchies that vampire immortality makes inevitable, where the only choice is between fighting now while we still possess advantages or accepting subjugation that will last until the end of time itself. Their battle raged through chambers that had witnessed similar confrontations throughout history as the partially materialized form of Malthus the Enslaver began to take shape within the ritual circle, its presence creating psychic pressure that made thought itself difficult, while ancient evil tested the boundaries of its magical prison with patience born of millennia, spent planning revenge against those who had dared to impose limitations on power that considered itself absolute and eternal. Aldrich arrived to face the growing manifestation with weapons blessed by vampire lords who had participated in the original banishment ritual, his combat skills enhanced by desperate determination to prevent his daughter from witnessing the kind of horrors that had scarred previous generations and driven some of the most powerful vampires in history to choose final death, rather than continue existing in a reality where such entities roamed freely among populations too fragile to defend themselves against appetites that viewed suffering as entertainment rather than necessary sustenance. The ancient ritual chamber trembled as Malthus the Enslaver's manifestation grew stronger with each drop of Dhampir blood that Cain's ceremony fed into the dimensional breach, reality itself seeming to buckle under the weight of an entity whose very existence violated the natural laws that kept worlds separate and civilizations stable, while Lyra realized with crystalline clarity that only her unique heritage provided the power necessary to reverse the summoning process before it reached the point of no return. Cain lay motionless among the scattered remnants of his ritual implements, his final moments marked not by the righteous fury she had expected, but by a terrible sadness that spoke of genuine love twisted into something monstrous, by fears that had consumed his ability to see any future, except the ones painted in blood and subjugation. And Lyra found herself mourning not just for the innocent lives he had destroyed, but for the father figure who might have been if circumstances had allowed his protective instincts to grow into wisdom rather than paranoia. The portal that connected their dimension to Malthus's prison realm pulsed with energies that made the air itself feel toxic, each wave of supernatural force bringing the ancient evil closer to full materialization, while the barriers erected by vampire and human mages 3,000 years ago cracked under pressure that their creators had never imagined would be brought to bear by one of the very bloodlines they had sworn to protect from such horrors. Elena's voice reached her through magical communication that strained against the dimensional distortions surrounding the ritual site, carrying instructions for a counter-ritual that required the willing sacrifice of Dhampir life essence to weave new barriers strong enough to contain an entity whose power had grown during millennia of imprisonment, and planning revenge against those who had dared to limit its freedom to reshape reality according to appetites that recognized no boundaries except those imposed by superior force. The ritual demanded everything she possessed and more, requiring her to channel not just her own supernatural abilities, but the accumulated magical potential of her entire bloodline, drawing power from connections that stretched back through generations of vampire lords and human mages who had contributed to the original binding while knowing that success would leave her drained beyond any possibility of recovery. Lyra began the counter-summoning with movements that felt like dancing on the edge of an abyss, each gesture pulling energy from sources that burned through her nervous system like liquid fire, while the partially materialized form of Malphus writhed within its weakening prison and tested her resolve with psychic attacks designed to shatter concentration through visions of futures where her sacrifice proved meaningless. And the ancient evil eventually found other paths to freedom that would make her death nothing more than temporary delay rather than permanent solution. The chamber filled with light that transcended any natural phenomenon, as Dampier magic reached levels that should have been impossible for someone so young and relatively untrained. But Lyra's unique heritage allowed her to access power reserves that lay dormant in most of her kind, while her mother's diplomatic training provided the mental discipline necessary to focus such energies toward constructive rather than destructive purposes, even as her life force flowed into magical patterns that grew stronger with each passing moment. Aldrich arrived at the chamber's entrance just as the counter-ritual reached its most dangerous phase, his ancient eyes taking in the scene with the horrified understanding of someone who had already lost everything once and now faced the prospect of watching his daughter follow her mother's path toward heroic sacrifice that would save countless lives while destroying the family he had only just begun to rebuild after 10 years of grieving what he had believed was lost forever. The desperate race against time that followed tested not just Lyra's magical abilities, but the bond between father and daughter that had been forged through shared blood and strengthened by mutual understanding of what it meant to love something enough to risk everything in its defense, as Aldrich threw himself into the counter-ritual with the reckless abandon of someone who refused to let his child bear such burdens alone, regardless of the personal cost such intervention might demand. Their shared vampiric heritage created a connection that allowed him to channel his own centuries of accumulated power into her efforts, the combined force of their bloodline's magical potential flowing through patterns that had been designed for a single participant but proved capable of supporting multiple contributors when love provided the motivation necessary to transcend normal limitations of supernatural ability and individual endurance. The burden of containing Malphas proved almost too much even for their combined efforts, the ancient evil's power testing every aspect of their magical defenses, while searching for weaknesses that might allow it to break free and begin the systematic destruction of civilizations that had dared to evolve beyond the fear and hatred that fed its particular form of supernatural appetite. But Lyra's immunity to the blood, curse that normally drove vampires toward territorial violence, proved crucial in maintaining the mental clarity necessary to weave binding spells that held firm against psychological attacks designed to shatter concentration through induced madness or despair. Father and daughter worked in harmony that transcended their decade of separation, their magical techniques complementing each other with the fluid precision of dancers who had rehearsed together for years rather than individuals who had only recently discovered their ability to cooperate. And gradually, the dimensional breach began to close, as their combined will imposed new barriers that drew strength not just from traditional magical sources, but from emotional connections that Malphas's purely predatory nature could neither understand nor effectively counter. The final moments of the ritual demanded sacrifices from both participants, aging Aldrich by decades in the space of minutes while burning through Lyra's supernatural abilities with such intensity that her enhanced senses flickered and failed before slowly beginning to return at levels reduced from their previous peaks. But when the last traces of interdimensional energy finally dissipated and the chamber fell silent, except for their exhausted breathing, both father and daughter remained alive and conscious, despite having expended magical resources that should have killed them or driven them permanently insane. The ancient evil had been banished once again, its prison reinforced with bonds that drew power from love rather than fear, and would grow stronger with each generation that chose cooperation over conflict, while Cain's ritual site bore no trace of the horrors that had almost been unleashed, except for scorch marks on stone that would serve as permanent reminders of how close their world had come to falling under the dominion of entities that viewed suffering as the highest form of art and mercy, as a weakness to be systematically eliminated. The weeks that followed the battle brought a strange mixture of celebration and mourning as Ravencrest Castle gradually returned to something resembling normal life, while its inhabitants processed the emotional and political implications of events that had reshaped relationships between supernatural and human civilizations in ways that would influence diplomatic efforts for generations to come. Lyra struggled with guilt over the hunters she had killed during the rescue operations and final confrontation, their faces haunting her dreams with accusations that her rational mind knew were unjustified, but her heart could not easily dismiss. While Aldrich helped her understand that protecting innocent life sometimes required making choices that left permanent scars on those strong enough to bear the burden of such necessary violence. Their conversations about morality and responsibility took place in gardens where Serafina had once conducted her own diplomatic meetings, the peaceful surroundings providing counterpoint to discussions about the prices that leaders paid for the privilege of making decisions that affected entire populations and the importance of maintaining compassion, even when circumstances demanded actions that seemed to contradict everything civilized societies claimed to value above survival itself. The journey to Serafina's grave became a pilgrimage that marked Lyra's transition from weapon shaped by others to individual, capable of choosing her own path. The simple stone marker, bearing her mother's name serving as focal point for grief that had been denied expression for 10 years, while she believed herself an orphan, rather than a daughter, whose parents had died protecting the principles she was now old enough to understand and embrace. Aldrich watched as his daughter knelt beside the grave and spoke words that honored both the woman who had given her life and the legacy she represented. Her promise to continue the work of building bridges between species carrying weight that transformed personal loss into public commitment, while allowing her to finally say goodbye to childhood and hello to responsibilities that her unique heritage made both burden and privilege. The castle itself seemed to come alive again, as delegations from human settlements and vampire covens arrived to negotiate new versions of the peace treaties that Cain's war had nearly destroyed, their discussions taking place in halls where portraits of Serafina watched over proceedings with expressions that seemed to approve of efforts to resurrect diplomatic solutions to problems that previous generations had attempted to solve through military force alone. Elena coordinated these negotiations with the efficiency of someone who had learned to separate emotional considerations from practical necessities, while ensuring that agreements reached during crisis situations would prove sustainable during periods of relative stability. When the memories of shared danger faded and old prejudices reasserted their influence over political decision-making processes that favored familiar patterns over innovative approaches to interspecies cooperation. 6 months after the final battle, Lyra stood before a joint council of human mayors and vampire lords in her official capacity as heir to Ravencrest and ambassador to the human world, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through actions rather than inherited it through bloodline alone, as she outlined plans for educational programs that would allow young people from both species to learn together in environments designed to break down the prejudices that had fueled centuries of unnecessary conflict and mutual misunderstanding. The school she had established in the castle's eastern wing represented more than just academic institution, serving as living symbol of the possibility for cooperation that transcended traditional boundaries, while providing practical training in diplomacy, languages, and cultural exchange techniques that would prepare future generations to build upon the fragile peace their parents had purchased with blood and sacrifice. Aldrich watched from his position at the council table as his daughter demonstrated the diplomatic gifts she had inherited from Serafina, combined with leadership skills forged through trials that had tested every aspect of her character. Her presentation addressing practical concerns about funding and curriculum while acknowledging the emotional barriers that made such projects difficult to sustain when political pressures favored separation over integration. The delegates responded with questions and suggestions that revealed both genuine interest in expanding educational opportunities and lingering suspicions about whether such programs would ultimately serve the interests of all participants or simply provide cover for one side to gain advantages over the other. But Lyra's patient explanations gradually addressed their concerns while building consensus around approaches that balanced idealistic goals with realistic assessments of what could be accomplished given current political and economic constraints. The council session was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger bearing correspondence that had traveled across continents to reach Ravencrest. A letter written in careful script by a young Dhampir in distant lands who had heard stories about the vampire princess who had helped prevent war between the species and wanted to establish contact with someone who might understand the challenges of possessing heritage that made acceptance difficult in either human or vampire communities, while providing unique opportunities to serve as bridge between civilizations that desperately needed such connections. The letter reminded Lyra that their work represented only the beginning of longer journey toward true coexistence. Its simple request for guidance and friendship, carrying implications that stretched beyond personal correspondence to encompass hopes for networks of cooperation that could span the globe and create foundations for peace that would prove strong enough to survive the prejudices and fears that had shaped interspecies relations since the beginning of recorded history. Aldrich and Lyra stood together on the castle's highest tower as sunrise painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise new beginnings built on foundations of love rather than fear. Their shared understanding of what had been sacrificed and what had been gained providing context for hopes that finally seemed achievable rather than merely idealistic dreams pursued by visionaries whose reach exceeded their grasp. While the dawn light revealed a world where the gap between light and darkness was being bridged by those who refused to accept that ancient hatreds represented permanent obstacles to progress toward futures where differences became sources of strength rather than excuses for conflict.